Well, early in the pandemic, we invited Dr. Robert Koopman, Chief Economist of the World Trade Organization, to brief the Asia House corporate network on the WTO's forecast for trade. The numbers for 2020 were bleak, although there were some even worse case scenarios. But broadly, the WTO expected a bounce back in trade in 2021. Well, the WTO now says that trade is indeed bouncing back. It's forecasting growth of 7.2% next year. In its latest report, the WTO also looks closely at the role of innovation and tech policies in an increasingly digitalized world economy. Well, let's get the outlook now from the WTO. And it's a great pleasure to welcome back to Asia House, Dr. Robert Koopman. Bob, very good to see you again. Thanks very much for joining us. We spoke 9 months ago. Your scenario was quite bleak at the time. And I think you mentioned that there are some other scenarios not published, worst case scenarios. What's the outlook now for 2021?
Hi, Michael. Well, it's great to talk with you again. So for 2021, we see a recovery, perhaps not as strong as a recovery as we might have expected given the extent of the downturn. So we see some scarring in the global economy. That's largely, though, due to a weaker recovery in GDP. So GDP has been a bit stronger in terms of its performance in 2020. But going forward, we see it as not recovering quite as quickly. No V-shaped recovery.
Right. Value chains, we talked about them, and they've been sort of on the agenda throughout the crisis, that there'd be a reworking of global supply chains because of the impact of the pandemic. Everything from just the realities of getting goods across borders to sort of trade nationalism. Have you seen that change in value chains, or have they held up pretty well?
Well, value chains have actually held up better than overall trade. So when you look at intermediate goods trade, it's performing slightly better than overall trade for manufactured goods. So that's a good sign. We see the value chains have been resilient in this downturn, which is quite different than what we saw in the 2008-2009 financial crisis. What we are seeing as a result of both the trade conflict prior to the pandemic, but also as a result of the pandemic, we see reorganization of supply chains. So we don't see a lot of re-onshoring. It's not showing up in the data. What we do see is a lot of movement of supply chains where firms are essentially looking at the risk versus efficiency trade-off and putting more emphasis on the risk side from the pandemic, but also from the previous trade conflict, and diversifying their supply chains a bit or moving them closer, nearshoring rather than reshoring.
So a regional reorganization of supply chains, and as you said, more nearshoring than reshoring. Have you seen more introduction of robotics and automation as part of this? Because that's been one of the theories, that rather than onshore or nearshore, if you're going to disrupt the supply chains, grab technology, we were talking about it earlier, and make the big leap. Have you seen that?
Well, that's hard to say because there's a lot of domestic activity. We see a lot of domestic mitigation that's definitely drawing upon new technology. And that's been very helpful in the recovery being stronger than many people expected. In terms of cross-border stuff, there's a lot of initiatives underway. You see things like distributed ledger technology. There's discussion now about some sort of vaccine passport, things that allow the movement of people, distributed ledger technology, which will allow goods to move more easily and quickly across borders. Those were trends. The DLT was a trend going on beforehand. Now with the pandemic, it's the movement of people that tends to be much more difficult. And we think that there'll be technology or digital related solutions that will help facilitate that kind of movement.
Your report did look at innovation and technology. Is that the sort of thing that it identified as trying to free up trade and encourage trade?
Well, we think what we focused on in that report was looking at the kinds of policies governments are using to encourage innovation. There's positive sides. What we've observed throughout history is that big innovating research programs spill over into other countries. So you don't have to innovate each thing locally. You can get those positive spillovers. What we worry about is where there might be negatives from those kinds of effects. And so Our report is really about trying to sort through those forces in getting governments to think about how can you arrange these policy environments to get the innovation you need, benefit from the spillovers, but reduce the negative spillover.
RCEP was signed a few weeks ago, and while generally perceived as having lower standards than some other multilateral deals, it seems to be a very significant agreement. Is that the way you're reading it?
It's significant in that there are a number of large players. I think we heard Ann Ruth talking about this. There's large players here that have not had agreements before. That's a positive thing. Overall, it's not really setting new rules so much as allowing for more market access within traditional trade rules. So we don't see a lot of innovation in data or technology and things like that.
Do you see any change in any shift in global trade imbalances, which has been a fundamental, a key issue politically, domestically, in societies? Has that shifted? Has that changed during the pandemic?
Well, no, unfortunately, there's been a reinforcement of the kinds of imbalances we were seeing before, at least up through, say, August. Although Germany has taken very significant action to stimulate demand on their side. But what we were observing was the traditional European US imbalances with Asia getting worse. But in the last couple of months, the trade data suggests that imports are increasing in Asia. That's a very positive thing. And that's the kind of thing we would need to see, I think, to help reduce global trade tensions, is for imports to grow faster in Asia, particularly aimed at the consumer household sector.
Just final question, Bob. Are you more optimistic now that we've had the developments of the last few weeks, including the election of Joe Biden, but also the development of a vaccine and the more positive outlook generally for the globe?
Yeah, I'm a bit more positive. I do think there's still a lot of uh, geopolitical tensions to work through. But I think the thing that makes me most optimistic has been the ability of governments, firms, and households to innovate in very small ways to mitigate the adverse impacts of the pandemic. And hopefully, governments, particularly and firms to some extent, will now learn to be better prepared for the next global shock.
With that, we need to leave it there. Dr. Bob Koopman, great to talk to you again. Thank you so very much. Good to see
Thank
you.
you, Michael.
Thank you.